If you're interested in audio applications, you're probably aware that plugins are software extensions that add functionality to a host program like Ableton. In the case of Live, plugins are virtual versions of audio processing devices like EQs and compressors, or MIDI devices like synthesizers and arpeggiators. Let's discuss the basics of plugin use in Live. So I've just got a default set open, and let's take a look at where we can access our plugins. So they're all over in the browser in the categories area. Now, the top three categories, sounds, drums, and instruments, allow you to access the Ableton Live instrument devices and instrument presets that are included with your version of Ableton Live. So if I go into the sounds category, I can pick a type, and then when I open that up, I'll see presets. Now, below that, I can go into the drums category, and these are all drum presets. And then below that, we can go directly to the various instruments. Now, I'm using Ableton Live Suite, so that's why you see this larger collection of instruments. And as always, at the top, we have a default preset. And if you open up an instrument or category, we can go down eventually and we can get to a preset. Now, after the instruments, we have audio effects. And again, these are the Ableton effects included with Ableton Live. And then after that, the same thing with MIDI effects. These are all Ableton MIDI effects. Now, next in the browser, we have Max for Live. And you might remember that we talked about Max being a visual programming language that users use to create audio and video devices. And we're lucky that we can use all of those devices within Ableton Live. So we see the three major categories here, and if you open them up, you'll see that there are dozens and dozens of user-created devices. So these are all little problem solvers, and I highly encourage you to get familiar with them. And then finally at the bottom, we have the plugins category, and this allows you to access your personal collection of third-party devices. So I've got things here like FabFilter and Native Instruments or Output and Spectrasonics. Now, if you don't see any plugins here, you'll need to go into Preferences to fix that. So that's under the Options menu on a PC and under the Live menu if you're on a Mac. So there are two basic formats of third-party plugins, and that would either be audio units or VST. Now, audio units are native only to a Mac computer, and the VST is a PC format that also can be used on Macs. So if I disable the audio units button here, you'll notice that I no longer have access to any of my third-party plugins. So you're going to want to make sure that you enable something here so that you can access these plugins. Now that we know what we have, I want to discuss briefly how we can use these. So on a MIDI track, we can actually use all three basic types: MIDI, instrument, and audio effects. But on audio and return tracks in Ableton Live, you can only use audio effects plugins. Now, on MIDI tracks, the device order really matters. We're only allowed to use MIDI effects first, and then they would be followed by a virtual instrument, and then an instrument would be followed by one or more audio effects. Now, example of that might include a MIDI arpeggiator plugin that is processing the MIDI signal, and in this case, probably converting it from a chord to a broken chord or arpeggio. And then that processed MIDI signal is being passed to an instrument, in this case, wavetable, which would convert that from a MIDI signal into an audio signal through wavetable synthesis. And then finally, it would pass the audio signal downstream to audio effects, which might include a compressor or an EQ or both or more. All right, so now that we've got that understood, let's briefly review how to load a device. So let's go to the instruments category. And with this first MIDI track selected, remember that I can load a device by simply double-clicking on it. So here I've loaded a default version of analog. Now, if I don't want that, I can click select it and hit my delete key. I can also add that plugin by click selecting it and dragging and dropping it onto the track. Or I can click select it and drag and drop it down here in device view. Now, device view is a lot like the plugin inserts that you would see in Pro Tools or in Logic, but instead of having kind of plug-in slots for those inserts, here it's more visual and we can just drag the plugin down here. Now note that the signal flow in device view flows from left to right. So for example, if I went into my audio effects category, and let's say I went into EQs and filters and grabbed an EQ8 and dragged and dropped it after that, and let's say I went into the dynamics category and let's get compressor. This time I'll point out that if I just double click on it, it will add it to the end of the device chain. So here we have the signal flow going from the virtual instrument through the EQ8 and then through compressor. So we've made a good start here in our discussion about plugins. Check out the next video where we'll continue with part 2 of plugin basics.